أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, before getting into the theme of the Khutbah today, I would like to just remind us to make dua for our brothers and sisters who are suffering throughout the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whether that suffering is self-inflicted, whether the suffering is within a family, whether the suffering is a result of what's called a natural disaster, or whether it's coming at the hands of other Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has made it clear that dua is the most powerful weapon that we have. And I need not remind you that this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam today is suffering. Just a very few quick examples. Look at the devastation that is going on in the Muslim country of Yemen. A devastation that's being brought about at the hands of other Muslims. A devastation that has created the most disastrous humanitarian crisis on the planet today. If we look throughout the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam today, we see that at least 70% of the refugees throughout the world are Muslims. And about an equal number of that 70% are refugees because of the actions of other Muslims. So let us remember our brothers and sisters in China, who almost 2 million are being locked in concentration camps. Rumors are coming out that those, perhaps many, will never come out because their organs are being harvested for the communist Chinese. We have many dua to make for our brothers and sisters, but do not let one day go by. Not one day when we not ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strengthen and to help our brothers and sisters throughout this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Brothers and sisters, I'll be brief with you today. And sometimes I feel like a person with a hammer who only can see nails, that everything a carpenter looks at, it looks like it needs to be hammered because of their profession. And because of how dear social justice issues are to me, I feel like that man with a hammer and find myself wanting to talk about our responsibility as believers to fulfill this mission of establishing a just society with our hands, with our mouths, with our hearts, by any means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the capacity to do it. brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the prophetic life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as you know better than I, established a society that was the most just in every element of the society. That there was no human society that could compare to that society, that state that was established under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That this leadership was a leadership that even though he was the Rasulullah, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam never gave preference to himself with over any other brother or sister, never gave preference to a claim over property, over ownership to anyone, even though he was the messenger of Allah. And there's so many examples throughout the Sirah and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we can bring this to life. There was a 30-year period, the Khulafa al-Rashidun, that this righteous caliphate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed to be maintained by 4 of the Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even if for only 30 years after the death of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that during this period, like that period under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for 10 years of Medina, that this additional 30 years give us so much incentive, or should give us so much incentive to establish justice in our personal and collective lives to whatever degree that we can possibly establish it. Let me just give one example and I'll move on. When we look at the brief caliphate of Ali ibn Abu Talib, radiallahu anhu, we find that there was an episode during this brief caliphate in which there was a Jewish man that Ali ibn Abu Talib saw with his armor. And he approached the man and told him, and I can't remember the man's name, but he approached him and said that this is my armor. I know my armor, my shield, my sword. I know my things. And the man said, no, it's not. So Ali went to a qadi, he went to a judge, and he said, well, we'll just take it to court and let the judge decide whose property this is. Ali spoke first, and he said that this is my armor. This belongs to me. And the man said, no, it doesn't, it's mine. And then the man said to Ali, do you have a witness to prove that this armor belongs to you? And Ali said, no, I don't. And then he realized that the requirements for justice under an Islamic order or government was so high that even though he and others probably knew, he knew for certain, but others felt that yes, this belonged to Ali, that Ali just smiled and said, he's right. It must be his. I can't prove it. Just go on and take the property. And so the man began to walk away with the property. Now keep in mind, this is the Khalid of all of the Muslims. And he's going as a plaintiff against a defendant who's not Muslim. The judge ruled against him, and Ali accepted the judgment. The man started to walk away. Then he turned around and came back. And the Sirah literature tells us that because of this incident, and the man saying to Ali that you have the right to just take this property from me, but you didn't do that. That there has to be something special about this religion that could cause the head of state, no one over you in authority on a worldly level at this point, and now you are relinquishing your property. And the man told Ali that I followed you one day when you were coming back from a campaign, and I saw you drop your armor, but you kept on going. And I realized that this is an opportunity for me to have what would be to me special armor, so I kept it. And then the man bore witness to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and bore witness to the finality of the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Khatam Nabiyin. Brothers and sisters, when we contrast, just by way of a small sample size, when we contrast what is going on in the Muslim majority countries today, when we contrast the level of idea of justice that you and I reflect on a day-to-day basis, whether it's within our homes, amongst the brotherhood, when we look at how far we are removed from this example that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, it makes me shudder to think of Qiyamah. It makes me shudder to think, as Anas ibn Malik, the Sahaba that lived longer than any of the Sahaba after the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after he remarked in his older age that today, speaking about in his lifetime, we are doing things that during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we wouldn't even dare think about these things. That we would remove ourselves from the presence of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam if we had even certain thoughts that lingered in our mind. But now we just disregard the Quran and the Sunnah almost on any occasion and feel no remorse for what we're doing. Brothers and sisters, now is a time for all of us to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to send the malaika to this earth to change the oppressive and the unjust ways of the Muslims. Look how far, just by way of an example, look how far we've come as an ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When the headlines for the last month have been that a critic of the monarchy, of the guardian of the two Haramains, was lured to an embassy in Turkey. And after getting there in that embassy, the Turkish government say that we have concrete evidence that 6 to 7 minutes after he came, Khashoggi came to this embassy, the man was choked to death and his body dismembered. How can you and I look at these kinds of actions on the part of our Muslim majority leaders and governments? How can we sit back silent when a nation, this same monarchy, bombs a tiny Muslim country for 3 years, creating death amongst children from malnutrition and these kinds of things, unlike we've seen in the 21st century. Brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has held this ummah to a different standard. And if you and I are to realize what we are supposed to be doing as part of this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it has to begin with our recognizing on whatever level, whether we are students, whether we are professionals in any field of profession, whether we are working in factories, whether we don't have jobs, whether we are driving Ubers or Lyfts or taxi cabs, that the responsibility on this Uber, the responsibility, I wrote an Uber over here, the responsibility on this ummah, that's the right end, that the responsibility on this ummah is the same. wherever we find ourselves on earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded, given this ummah a mandate. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kunu qawmina bil qisti shuhada lillahi. That, oh, you who believe, stand out firmly for justice. Or even a better translation, be standard bearers for justice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as witnesses to Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting this issue of our discharging the responsibility of bringing about justice in the society as a tenement, as a fundament of our bearing witness to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ayah goes on to talk about even if that justice is against yourself, that if someone is criticizing you, if someone is correctly or even incorrectly saying things against you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this mandate on this ummah that we stand for what is just, even if it's against ourselves, even if it's against our family, our loved ones, whether it's against the rich or whether it's against the poor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this mandate that never changed. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His assistance against the evils of our minds and the unsuccessfulness of our actions. Whomsoever Allah guides, no one can lead astray. And whomsoever Allah calls us to action, as a result of their deeds, no one can guide aright. O Allah, help those who help the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and count us amongst them. O Allah, disappoint those who try to disgrace the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and do not make us unknown. Brothers and sisters, with no intention to offend, and so my comment is first directed to myself. I'm saying this as a reminder to myself and as a reminder to you. But when we look at the actions of the Ummah, and I'm talking the part of the Ummah in this part of the world, and more particularly in the United States, that when we look at our actions in the late 20th and 21st century up to this day, I have to say that I and we have fallen short in our responsibility to take stands, meaningful stands for making things right in the environment in which we live. There's an expression, and I don't know where this expression comes from, but the expression is that a dead leaf can float on the water, but it takes a living being to go against the flow of a stream. And I submit for the purpose of this khutbah today, that during the latter half of the 20th century and this part of the 21st century, this part of the Ummah in the United States has been like a dead leaf, floating along, going with the tide, just floating with the current, as opposed to taking a stand and standing up and doing what may be difficult, doing what may not win you and will not win you any popularity contest in the society in which you live. That taking a stand for justice is not just something that you just wake up one day and say that I'm going to be a standard bearer for justice as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded that I be. It's something that has to be rooted in an understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's something that if you and I want to get closer to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will take on this mandate from Allah to be the standard bearer in the same way that people like Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin took this on before coming to Islam in 1971, and has continued to be that standard bearer for justice, even under the conditions that he's been locked up for now almost a couple of decades. Brothers and sisters, just to share a quick anecdote. I visited Imam Jamil a few times since his incarceration. And every single time that I have visited this brother, I've been ashamed of the weakness of my advocacy for justice. I've been ashamed of how I've made excuses as to why I can't do this, or why I shouldn't do that, or why I shouldn't try to direct the community of which I'm a part, to direct it in a certain way. That it is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have brothers and sisters who, in spite of the obstacles that they face, and there are so many Muslim sisters today who put me to shame, who put maybe some of you to shame, as far as they're taking a position covered in hijab. Every time they walk outside of their houses, they're taking a very front street position that I am Muslim, that regardless of what is the norm in the society, I'm not a dead leaf floating down a stream, that I'm a living, breathing organism that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the capacity to make decisions about and to do what we can to establish right. Brothers and sisters, there are so many issues, there are so many areas that years from now, when the history of the Islam in the United States will be written, that you and I, living in the time that we're living in, we are going to be held accountable by those who come after us, by our children, our grandchildren, by our great-grandchildren, but more importantly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold us accountable for what did we do living in this part of the 21st century, living at a time that may be one of the most oppressive periods in modern history. What did we do when a prison industrial complex was snatching up so many from the people of color? What did we do? What did we do when we found out that slavery was not abolished if a person is incarcerated? And then we find out that this nation has realized that it's cheaper to insource jobs into the prisons than to establish factories overseas. And so we have our brothers and sisters working for 23 cents an hour or less throughout this prison industrial complex. What did we do when we recognized the injustice that is in this so-called judicial process? What did we do as an ummah? What did we do as a Muslim community when so many of our African American brothers and some sisters are being brutally shot down and killed? And if they're not killed, we see videos every day how it's making the beating of Rodney King in 1991 look like a children's outing on the playground. What did we do as Muslims? when we see these things, how does it strike us? How, as a student, do you feel when you see these things on social media? What does it do to compel you? What feelings of being compelled to do something do we have? Brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you know better than I, is a witness to all that we do. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold us responsible for our actions or our inactions. That if the only thing that we can do, which the Prophet ﷺ has said is the greatest weapon at our disposal, if all we can do is make dua, don't let a salah go by when we don't make dua, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relieve those who are suffering, who are all of us, from the system of dhulm, the system that is undergirded from the very beginning by white supremacy. Don't let a salah go by without begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to relieve some of the suffering of all of us. There's not a person in this country, Muslim or otherwise, that is not infected by the undergirding of the United States, what this system rests upon. And you and I, unlike our brothers and sisters from the Ahlul Kitab, in particular the Christians talk about this ideal society that would be based on the teachings of Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam. But they have no practical example. They don't have anything. They don't have a clue as to how to establish a family based on the teachings of Allah in its entirety, how to establish societies based on the teachings of Allah. We have no excuse. Even though the time was short with the Prophet Muhammad in Medina of just 10 years, even though the righteous scholars was a relatively short period of just 30 years, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala renews the example for us, has renewed it throughout the centuries of Islam. We have no excuse. We have a book that doesn't change, that hasn't been messed with at all. We have a sunnah that's been protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. Brothers and sisters, we have no excuse. So let's make a commitment right here, right now, today, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the resolve and the determination to understand first our responsibilities and duties to this adl, to this justice, and how we can realize our duties and responsibilities. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us knowledge that is beneficial for us in this world and in the next. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not make this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam an object of test for the disbelieving people. We come to Salah. Oh, you have any announcements?
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.